Hello and Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to Atiyah on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio, Wolverhampton, online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In the previous show, our guest, Dr. Abdullah Mia, a consultant clinical psychologist working in the NHS in private practice and at Pebble practice, shared information about psychological therapy for men and his work supporting ethnic minority communities. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further mental health information on my Twitter feed at Atiyah3. In the show today, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support your well-being and the well-being of others, because everyone's mental health matters. We will have a continued focus on mental health and emotional well-being, in particular exploring how we can have self-care, positive self-care during these difficult times and during the challenging times and beyond. We won't be taking any live calls within the show or any messages for this show for today. In the show today, we will be discussing self-care in relation to emotional well-being. Being mindful of our mental health is vital during these stressful times. When we are feeling unwell, mentally or physically or both, we sometimes can't think clearly as when we are well. Excuse me. This has an impact on our emotional resilience, leading us to feeling less in control over our emotions, and usually easy tasks become difficult to complete. How can we build our emotional resilience? What helps? It is suggested that one of the first steps to mood management and emotional resilience would be noticing any mood changes and recognizing any differences. We may notice that we've dipped in mood, or we are worrying more than usual, or more than needed in the given situation. Once we recognize we need to feel better in mood or feel less worried, we can focus on how to help ourselves to feel better. As the government introduces further restrictions due to COVID-19 and our well-being, for our well-being, we notice that we are beginning to worry about this again. Our guest aims to provide insight to emotional well-being and self-care strategies that can support us with this. Our guest today is Myra Khan. She is an accredited counsellor, supervisor, therapeutic coach, and workshop facilitator. Myra is also the founder of the Muslim Counselling and Psychotherapist Network and runs her own company, Myra Khan Counselling. Welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show, Myra.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me on.
That's okay. How did you become interested in working in mental health? Let's start with that.
Well, that's really interesting. It wasn't actually so much coming from an actual mental health perspective. I think I came into this profession more from the position of being a counsellor and providing therapeutic support. And I think it's important to make the distinction between then counselling and therapy and then mental health, because for many people, they think that, well, counselling only deals with mental health, and actually counselling is far broader than mental health. Actually, with counselling, mental health might be one of the things we support, but not the only issue we support. So for me, it was much more coming from a perspective of, I want to support people with mental health, but I want to support people with all the different issues that I work with day in, day out.
Right. So in terms of counselling, what is it and then who is it for? I mean, I think you said you can work with a lot of people and different issues. What is counselling? How would you describe it?
So counselling for me is providing a safe, confidential, supportive space for somebody to be able to sit with me and feel supported in them thinking about, reflecting on, and coming up then with best ways of thinking about, handling, coping with, thinking of what's going on for them. So counselling for me is about facilitating a process for somebody to be able to sit with and reflect on either a current issue or concern they're going through, or equally to be able to sit with, reflect on, and understand a past experience that they still find distressing or traumatic or upsetting or impactful in their life in any way. And in terms of then the clients I work with and the issues, as you just mentioned, I work with children and young people, I work with adults individually, I work with couples, and also then older people. And across that age range then, and those clients then are from all different backgrounds, all different ethnicities and faiths and cultures. But amongst them, amongst all those different communities and clients I work with, there are then lots of different issues that happen, or life experiences or events that are common across all these different communities. And it's those different issues that I work with. So for example, anxiety, depression, bereavement, relationship issues, particularly when I do the couples counselling, that's all about working with relationship issues. Or it might be issues with work, bullying. It might even be more internal in terms of working with identity and self-esteem and personal development. And then, of course, then there's mental health. And so this is what I mean about mental health being just one of the many issues that I work with, but it's a very broad in terms of what we do work with and support.
Right. That sounds very interesting. And like you said, it's a wide range of clients across the broad spectrum. And the issues that you've listed there. With regards to unhealthy psychological habits and rumination and overthinking, I know you said that mental health was a small part, but in the issues that you mentioned there, would there be some of this going on then?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is the it almost brings us full circle, really, because again, when it very common, some of these traits or characteristics or behaviors, like you've just mentioned, like the overthinking, the rumination, they're very common, and we have to recognize that it doesn't automatically mean that you have a mental health problem. Like, it's not a mental health issue, or that you don't have, or that if you are somebody that overthinks and ruminates, that you then have a mental illness. Some of these behaviors and actions are, whilst they might be unhealthy in themselves, I absolutely do want to address that it doesn't automatically mean that you have a mental illness with it then. So something like overthinking and rumination then might be a part of somebody who has anxiety, or somebody who is going through a particularly stressful time. It's a reflection or a characteristic of that. So it's really important that we don't get caught up in thinking then that, okay, that's that those characteristics of overthinking or rumination then are only for somebody then that has a mental illness. So, and that's what I mean about, that's why counselling then is so applicable and relevant to so many people, because it's not just for those with a mental illness. So if you're somebody who overthinks and ruminates, then counselling actually is really supportive for you, because what we will do in that space then is work through and process and reflect on what actually is causing that. And whenever I think of somebody who is then overthinking or ruminating, the feeling underneath it, and this is what we will then work with in counselling, is that that signifies a really raised level of anxiety. And so I will then work with, well, what's the anxiety that is driving then this overthinking and rumination?
Yeah, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. So if you're saying that it's not on the offset of mental health illness, and lots of people on a daily basis do ruminate and overthink, would that help the process then of people understanding that counselling doesn't have perhaps that stigma attached to it as other services?
Yeah, absolutely. If we put it, and again, I know often people parallel it and compare it to kind of physical health, but if you think about the spectrum of physical health that we can have, it's exactly the same. So if you think about all the different ailments, physical ailments that we might go to the doctor for, it might be at the mild end of that spectrum, all the way through to very severe and life-threatening or lifelong physical health conditions. And it's the same thing with counselling. So I see people across that spectrum of emotional health and mental health. So from mild all the way through to more severe mental illness. And I think that's really helpful then to think about. So for anyone then thinking about, well, is it bad enough, am I feeling bad enough to come for counselling? It's not, there is no threshold. There is no sense of you have to be suffering to any greater degree in order to access counselling. If at any point in your life you feel that you could do with some extra support because you are emotionally struggling, and even if that is in a mild way, and that you feel that talking to somebody is going to help you to better understand it, then absolutely counselling is suitable for you. I think the problem is that for a lot of people, the challenge is rather that for a lot of people, they come to counselling when things have really escalated, and they come into it when something is actually far more progressed than what it needed to have been. So if at any point you recognise, actually, I could do with talking to somebody, then absolutely that's the point in which you access counselling.
Yeah, and with the World Mental Health Day coming up on the 10th of October, I think it's a very prominent and key issue to highlight that counselling is there, not necessarily, you can access counselling, not necessarily when you are feeling severely ill or poorly, or when the issues have come to a head. You can access it at an earlier stage. How do we promote that within communities?
I think the promotion of it is almost, it's twofold for me. It's the first step is us removing the stigmas and barriers around it, and to talk more about mental health. And I recognise that a lot of investment and a lot of work has been poured into that first step around initiatives and drives and campaigns around mental health. World Mental Health Day, as you've mentioned, is actually one of those strategies. The very fact we have a World Mental Health Day means we talk about it. That's the first step. For me, more importantly, more crucially actually, is the second step, which is the actual counselling, talking therapy, psychological services and resources and counsellors and therapists that people then need to go and see. Step one on its own is the acknowledgement of a problem or an issue. Step two is then the treatment of it. And the treatment of it, then I think that's the part for me which we also need to champion. And with the Muslim Counselor and Psychotherapist Network, it's a network that I set up. It's now been going for over 7 years. It is a organisation that identifies and promotes that second step. So on the MCAPN, on the Muslim Counselor and Psychotherapist Network website, then we have a counselling directory, and that is a counselling directory of Muslim counsellors, therapists, and counselling psychologists. So for me, that is step two in terms of how do we, as Muslim communities, actually get people within our community access then to that support. So that directory then, all the practitioners on that directory then are qualified, registered counsellors and therapists and psychologists. And that for me is really important, because in a profession in which actually I think it's really hard to identify who is adequately trained, who is professional, everyone on that directory has been checked and verified. So you're going to somebody that has had the robust and appropriate training to actually work with you.
That sounds fantastic and important actually for a lot of people who want to access support and are unaware of what works for them and which professionals they should approach. So that's the MCAPN website, did you say?
Yes, so that is mcapn.co.uk. Equally, if you Google Muslim Counselor Network, it will come up. The other thing I just want to add to that as well, which is for anyone that is then currently looking at either in counselling or therapy, or looking to access therapy, and they're currently in the stages of either contacting counsellors or therapists or looking for one, or as I said, already working with somebody, please check their credentials. It's really important that you are working with somebody who is trained. Make sure that they openly, transparently, and honestly show you their qualifications, and that you can check those and verify those with a professional body that they are registered with. I appreciate that there are lots of people, well-intentioned people in our community, that want to support other people that are struggling. Counselling is a specialist profession. And so what I often find are people coming to me having gone to so-called other professionals in the field because other people have just set themselves up as a counsellor, or they say that they offer support or emotional support within another job that they do. If they're not trained specifically to do counselling, then that's a real ethical problem, because they are not then able to professionally and ethically offer you a safe space, a professional, appropriate space to properly support you. So I do recognise that many well-intentioned people within communities want to help one another. And I just hope that for those clients then that are looking for counselling, that they then do the checks and verifications of the people that they're going to for that help, advice and support. So please do make sure that the people you're going to are actually trained and qualified. It's the similar with again, if we put it in the parallel of physical health, you wouldn't just go to any doctor if you didn't know that they were qualified and registered, and you wouldn't just go to somebody who says, oh yeah, I haven't been trained, or I'm not formally professionally registered. Oh, but I can. Oh, but I'm really well intentioned to help you. Like I said, it's not yes, I really appreciate and grateful for people's intentions, but also people that go for counselling, people that need this help and support, are in a very vulnerable position. And I think the duty of care as a community, as Muslim communities, there's a duty of care and an ethical responsibility on us that we as a community provide ethical support based on what anyone in our community needs at that time. Just as I would then refer somebody on, if they then need physical health support, I would refer them on to their GP and to the appropriate specialist services. So that's why I just want to make the point of, please make sure that you're going to the suitable professional within our community for the particular help you need at any given point.
Fantastic, thank you, Moira, for that. Now, if we go back to recognising kind of mood differences, some people would say that it requires a self-awareness, and you talked earlier about self-esteem and self-awareness, I suppose, and promoting self-care can help encourage emotional resilience. Can you share your understanding of self-awareness? What are the signs that people should look out for, the early signs, let's say?
Early signs of self-awareness?
Early warning signs of recognising the mood differences.
Okay, yes. And absolutely, all those key words you have just said, the self-awareness, self-care, well-being, change in mood, absolutely, they are all interconnected. We can only know consciously how we feel and what mood we are in if we actually check in with ourselves. And that's the self-awareness bit. We can only be aware of ourselves, we can only be aware of our mood if we actually take the time to check in and actually take that moment of self-reflection and self-attunement, and to ask ourselves, how am I feeling? And only by developing that relationship with ourselves and to ask ourselves that and to do regular check-ins, can we then track any changes in our mood. If we don't track that, we cannot then know whether our mood has changed at all. So again, it's almost like a three-step process, actually. One, let me build a self-awareness with myself. Let me check in with myself consistently, regularly. Second of all, then, how am I feeling at that time? And then thirdly, is that a change in my mood? For a lot of people, we are so caught up in being cognitive, and what I call, we're very often up in our heads. Yeah, we're busy doing things, we're busy thinking, we're busy focused on things external to us, that we don't perhaps spend as much time being. And of course, we're human beings, not human doings. But I think change in lifestyle, change in technology, change in how we live our lives means that very often we operate from a place of doing rather than being. Yet, to be self-aware, to be self-reflective, requires us to be being rather than to be doing. And so to develop a self-awareness with yourself, you have to spend time being with yourself and being connected to yourself. And that is then the shift of getting out of your head, essentially, and tracking how you feel within yourself. And for many people, it's about then tracking how their body feels, tracking perhaps what's the feeling that they have within them. So for some people, it's about checking in with their gut, because for many people, it's their gut that kind of holds their feelings, perhaps. So it's a shift into developing this relationship with yourself and checking in with yourself and being with yourself to then understand whether your mood then has changed. Because only once we know how we're feeling, only once we know what our mood is, are we then, the fourth step is then able to identify what do we then need. So based on how I feel, based on my mood, that is an indication, a signal to me. It's my own bodily signal to me that this is how I'm feeling right now. And there might then be a need, an emotional need that is attached to it. So if I am feeling upset, I then might think, okay, I'm feeling upset. So what do I then need to support and to soothe or to comfort my upset? And then step 5 is I go and do that, whatever that is. That might be, for example, I'm upset. I might want to ring my best friend. I might want to actually go for a walk. I might want to spend some time on my own. I might want to journal. I might want to go and play a sport and, or go for a run or go for a swim, just to get that, just to be able to process that physical feeling within me. So you can start to see how self-awareness, self-attunement allows you to be connected and attuned to your mood, but but alongside it, and just as importantly, it then allows you to create self-care and a self-care plan, so that you then start to find ways of supporting your own emotional health. And of course, one of those options then, I know I've mentioned running, swimming, going to the gym, ringing a friend, journaling. Another option is going for counselling.
Right. So you would consider that as self-care at the stage where one needs it?
Counselling is an ultimate form of is one of those main ways, a very obvious way of self-care. It is just as people go for a run to clear their head, or go for a swim, or go to the gym, because it might process feelings in the action. Counselling is another way of processing your feelings. And so counselling absolutely is a form of self-care.
Right. In your experience, are there other forms of self-care and emotional well-being tips that you could give us? So you've mentioned a whole list there of varied activities. Some might suit some individuals, and to be fair, there's probably many individuals who don't do any of those things, or have never started to do any of those things. How would we encourage people to look after themselves in that way?
Yes. So this is the beauty of self-care in a way, which is that it is a care for yourself and of yourself. So so people individually need to find, what is it that is caring to me? For some people, going for a run is a way of caring for themselves. For other people, it's the idea of a nightmare. So this idea that self-care is a one-size-fits-all is not true. So there might be some very common self-care activities, but if they are not caring to you, I think some people feel pushed into doing them, or feel actually like a failure if they don't get the results that they're looking for. If people are being told, I should go to yoga, or I should go for a run, but when I go and do those things, I don't feel any better, I actually feel worse, or they just don't do it for me, then stop doing it. the beauty, as I said, the beauty of self-care is you do activities that actually are effective. And even if you go and Google self-care, a self-care wheel, what it will come up with is almost a bit like a pie chart, which identifies all the different forms of self-care that connect to different aspects of our being. So some self-care is physical, other self-care is emotional, other forms of self-care is spiritual. So for example, running is, yes, self-care, but it's a physical form of self-care. Praying, meditating is a spiritual form of self-care. Emotional self-care might be counseling or journaling, for example, or reading a book. Yeah. So if you Google self-care wheel, it will come up then with lots of examples of different self-care activities. But the key in all of this then is to find self-care activities that actually work for you. For some people, if they are more creative, they might find then creative interests and hobbies, drawing, painting, any kind of craft activity or hobby might suit them then. So my advice to anybody is try things out and see how you feel doing them. Then you are both doing and being, and you are taking care of yourself. And that's a way of tracking then, is this actually helping me? Is this meeting my emotional needs? Is this making me feel better?
Yeah, and with the current situation, we might not be able to do certain self-care activities.
Yeah.
Some of
Yeah.
them, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to agree and say, yeah, what I have supported and spoken a lot about during lockdown since March is that for many people, it's really clear that people's mental health really suffered during lockdown. And it is exactly because of this. It is because self-care activities that they would have ordinarily have done have been, and they're not able to access. Also, a huge change in lifestyle and routine. So many factors actually cause a lot of people for their mental health or emotional health to struggle. But for equally on top of that, it's one of those factors is because we don't then have access to our regular self-care activities. So again, right now, if you're thinking about self-care and what might I do for myself, think about what's feasible. You know, that there was something going back to the beginning of lockdown. You know, there was a reason why we were given that 1 hour of exercise outside. That was a chance for people to go and do some physical self-care. So, and of course now we are at the start of this potential second wave. We are potentially going back into kind of lots of local lockdown and more restrictions. So again, my advice is find things that you are able to do. There is no point trying to identify self-care activities that you say, oh, I'll try this for self-care, but actually I can't do it now, so I won't bother doing any at all. Think about, what self-care can I do now? Equally, you might start to identify self-care activities that you think, I would like to do that. I can't do it now, but I'll try that or do that after certain lockdown restrictions have been lifted. And just keep them in a journal or in your diary and revisit them and go back to them and think, okay, I'll try those things later. But don't let that stop you from not practicing self-care now. There are lots of things we can do right now for the fact that we can be in our own homes and do things in our own homes. Equally, we're still able to go out. For those people that can, I appreciate there are some vulnerable people. There are people perhaps that are shielding, people that don't want to go out. But think about and be creative actually with what you're able to do in your own home. Lots of emotional and spiritual self-care are activities you can absolutely do indoors. And so think about those activities and see what you can do. And it might be picking up a new hobby or skill. If you have access then to the internet at home and you're there and you can go onto YouTube and see what hobbies and activities you might want to pick up and learn. So again, be creative about how you're accessing self-care.
Yeah. Mindfulness. What are your thoughts on mindfulness? Because that's something that can be done at home and perhaps when people go for walks, etc. What are your thoughts on mindfulness?
Yeah. mindfulness is both a practice of self-care in and of itself. It is also a way of being as you go about your daily life. So it's either, and what I mean by that is that either mindfulness is something in which you practice and that's what you're doing in the moment, such as, right, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on my own doing absolutely nothing, a bit like a meditation, and I'm going to practice mindfulness, in which then I'm going to sit and sit with and attune myself to my conscious being and my surroundings consciously. And that is what you are doing and practicing in that time. Equally, mindfulness actually is how we are being during our prayers, because mindfulness then is that focus on the prayer that we are doing. So when we are praying and we are asked to put everything else out of our minds and to focus purely on what we are saying, reciting, and what we are physically doing in our bodies, that is our 5 daily ways of practicing actually practicing mindfulness within prayer. So we already have it embedded in our Islamic lifestyle already. Mindfulness then has been taken and adopted by a Western philosophy and a Western culture and lifestyle. And it's almost something then that we think we have to then reintegrate back into our lives, when actually it's been there all along. It's just that it's been labeled now and branded as mindfulness. So for anyone really listening, it's about going, actually, you do that already. We're being asked to practice mindfulness already in our prayer, in our daily prayers. But how we can also practice it if we actually want to strengthen our ability to be mindful. And I think that's the bit that I think we can all do, which is that second thing that I spoke about, which is being mindful or practicing mindfulness in just our everyday. When we go about our everyday, are we being conscious of where I am, who I'm with, how I am feeling? Again, that self-attunement. It's being conscious of me, myself, how I'm feeling, and my surroundings, and how this whole experience is feeling. And we can do that then at any point throughout the day. And so that is a way of practicing and strengthening our mindfulness ability. A bit like going to the gym and lifting weights. The more we do it, the stronger we get doing it. The same thing with mindfulness is that we can practice it a bit like weightlifting. It's a weight, it's a strength in us that the more we do, the better we are at doing it. And that then will also help, and we're practicing it in our daily 5 prayers, but it also will help us then to be able to be more mindful in our prayers as well.
How would we, Myra, encourage children to be more mindful? Let's say if we're going for a walk and taking in your surroundings mindfully, how would we encourage young people to be more mindful?
So for children, it's the practice then of just being consciously aware of what's around us. So taking children for a walk, you might ask some questions on that journey, mindfulness questions, that what is it that we can see around us? What are you noticing? How are you feeling? So what you're doing is you're getting children to be in relationship with themselves and with their environment, rather than going on a walk and just being glued to your mobile phone, or on a phone call perhaps, or I don't know, listening to a podcast or an audio because you go for a walk. Actually, in a way, it's about disconnecting from something that is virtual and actually connecting in the moment. And that's the key thing with mindfulness, is that we are connecting in this very moment. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about what we need to do later in the day. We're not thinking about what we're going to eat for dinner that evening. What we're doing is we are being fully present in the moment, and that is mindfulness. So asking children if you take them for a walk, or how they're feeling right now, is, how are you feeling in this moment? What are we doing right now? How are we relating to one another? How are we relating to the environment that we're in? How am I relating to myself? So it's all about being in the moment. And with children especially, I think they are naturally, we're intuitively able to do this, but it gets almost pushed into the background within us because life takes over. We get caught up in the doing rather than the being. But actually, we innately and intuitively are able to be in the moment. And so with children, that's what children do day in, day out. They're not worried about what they're going to necessarily eat for dinner that evening. They're not necessarily worried about the next day even. Children are actually a really good way for adults to practice mindfulness and being in the moment. Kids, if you take them out and they play, they're being in the moment. So actually, children are role models to adults for mindfulness.
Fantastic. Myra, all of the points that you've mentioned are very enlightening, so thank you for that. You talked earlier about counselling addressing bereavement, and as you may be aware, during this COVID period, there have been many losses for families, either COVID related or not, and people have been unable to grieve. What kind of advice would you give to those people who are still finding themselves grieving?
Yes.
And not going through the natural grieving process in terms of meeting with others and the funeral being as it would have been.
Yes. Yeah. I think you've actually kind of really hit the nail on the head there in terms of what's been taken away from people that are going through bereavements during this time is what would have been the perhaps social, societal, cultural ways of grieving and having that grieving process. And the reason we have those cultural and faith rituals is in order for us to process grief and to help us process the grief. And when those things are taken away, we then have to find other ways of grieving. And whilst we have those rituals in place, we have to recognize that, well, some of the reason those rituals are there, particularly cultural reasons of, meeting up at that family home and going there every day, then potentially for the next week or two, we have to recognize, again, I absolutely want to make clear here and explicit that there's a difference between the Islamic ritual of what needs to be done for a funeral and then what culturally you might do based on your cultural community and also your own immediate family. Yes, I want to make a distinction between the two. So putting aside the Islamic process of how a funeral is conducted and how you then grieve for the days afterwards, what I want us to be able to really think about is that both the Islamic ritual, the Islamic process, but more importantly, the cultural rituals that we have inherited or that we have within perhaps our own family or own like local community, we have to think that they are all there in order to support our grief, our feelings, our loss. Yeah. And because of that, then we have to think, okay, if I would ordinarily have those in place to process how I'm feeling and to support my grief, what am I needing instead to support my feelings? Yeah. Because very often, again, we get caught up in the doing rather than the being. And because the doing bit is taken away, I can't go and then go to that family's home. I can't sit with them and perhaps read or pray with them because I can't physically be with them. You have to think, what am I able to do under current restrictions? And what am I able to do? Again, self-care. What am I able to do that will instead support how I feel? So there is something about we've got to hold on to the fact that this comes down to how we are feeling. It's about a grief, and that grief needs to be processed. So it's about recognizing what I would ordinarily do to process my feelings. What do I need to do instead? And again, that might be then I need to be on the phone, rather than seeing people in person. It's about then going, okay, well, I'll do Zoom calls with people, or I'll spend time with my family, the family, within my family home, of course, within my social, I will spend time more with them, and I will take time out and spend that space with them. But to recognize and to honor how you feel is how you feel. I think, again, there is something about just because we can't do those doing rituals, just because we physically can't do the same thing, does not mean that we then also put aside, we're not going to put our grief on hold because we can't potentially meet up with our family. for example. And actually all that causes is what we define as delayed grief or complicated grief. You're doing yourself no favor by saying or feeling as if, well, now I can't process that grief because I'm not with that family, or I can't be with the people that I would ordinarily be with that would support me in my grief. You've got to start thinking about, well, what can I do instead that's going to support how I feel?
Yeah, where does counselling come into play? When do people then reach out for counselling when it comes to grief? When do we know that actually I need some further support?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, counselling is a perfect place to come to following a bereavement if you want that and need that additional support. We recommend, though, not to come for counselling immediately after a bereavement has happened. And the reason we say to leave it a few weeks or a few months, only because in those first few months or weeks, again, you mentioned, that there are those stages of grief. Shock denial plays a huge part in that. And you won't be able to actually access the depths of your grief within those first few weeks or months because it's too raw and it's too fresh. And our bodies, our souls, our emotional well-being kicks in to defend against us feeling that grief. And so what you will often find is actually in the first month, maybe or so, few weeks or months after a bereavement, you may not feel it. You'll feel numb for a while. And to come to counselling in that window of time actually is not going to help because you won't be able to access your grief. Very often we recommend for people to come to the point where they no longer feel numb and they're sitting with the loss. Because for a few weeks or months after a bereavement, there's a valid reason why we have that numbness, and we're in shock and denial. And that's because it allows us then to actually get on with things like the funeral arrangements. It allows us actually to cope with the trauma of the loss. And so we recommend coming for counselling a few months after a bereavement has happened.
Thank you, Myra. We are coming quickly towards the end of the show, and I think it might be helpful to end on some self-care tips and just a reminder of what you've mentioned earlier in terms of positive self-care and the kind of activities that people can engage in as we finish the show.
Yes, so I recommend Googling the self-care wheel, which will give you lots of ideas of what self-care you might want to do. And I really encourage people to be creative and to be open to trying new self-care things to do. See what works, but most importantly, recognise what does work for you and then do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Myra, for sparing your time today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. As mentioned earlier in the show, you can catch more mental health information on my Twitter at Atiyah Ali3. Myra Khan has also mentioned some the mcapn.co.uk network website that you could access for further support. You can listen back to this show and previous shows on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel. Thank you for listening in. You'll hear from me on the first Saturday of every month. And in the next show, we will be focusing on relationships. If you want to make a change for World Mental Health Day, please do put up your statuses on WhatsApp. Please do put up messages on your Insta and other social media promoting self-care, well-being, and looking after our mental health as we do our physical. Thank you for tuning in today.